Reason can test the coherence of what follows, but it cannot validate the origin. This realization does not weaken reason, it refines it. You no longer ask reason to provide what it cannot offer. Instead, you allow it to serve its true function: clarification, correction, refinement. You see that the power of rational thought lies not in providing unshakable certainty but in illuminating the structure of what can be known. Al Ghazali understood that reason must eventually confront its own boundary. When you reach that boundary, something shifts. The pursuit of certainty becomes less forceful. You recognize that understanding requires more than inference. It requires an inner transparency that reason alone cannot create. Within this clarity, you treat thought not as a final authority but as one aspect of knowing, valuable yet limited, precise yet incomplete. Al Ghazali turned next to the self, the quiet influencer of thought. He observed that many intellectual errors arise not from faulty reasoning but from subtle motives. Preference can shape analysis. Fear can dictate interpretation. Identity can guide what the mind accepts or rejects. You begin to recognize this within yourself. Before an argument even forms, the self is already active. It selects information that supports its continuity. It dismisses what threatens its stability. This activity happens before conscious thought and long before rational evaluation. When you see this interference clearly, a new kind of honesty emerges. You no longer assume that your conclusions arise from pure logic. You understand that reasoning often serves the self rather than truth. This realization is not discouraging, it is clarifying. By acknowledging the influence of the self, you remove an obstacle that distorts perception. Al Ghazali suggested that inner purification is essential for accurate understanding. When the self becomes quieter, thought becomes clearer. Without the need to defend identity, reason functions more freely. You begin to observe thought not as an extension of who you are, but as a movement passing through awareness. In this state, clarity is no longer tied to the protection of the self. It becomes a matter of seeing without interference. With the self's influence exposed, doubt becomes a constructive force. Al Ghazali treated doubt not as an attack on knowledge but as a practice of refinement. Doubt removes what is weak so that what remains is genuinely stable. You begin to use doubt not to dismantle your understanding but to examine its foundation. This approach transforms the nature of questioning. Instead of asking whether a belief is correct, you ask how it formed. Instead of defending a conclusion, you observe the path that produced it. Doubt ceases to be corrosive. It becomes diagnostic. It reveals the layers of assumption, intellectual, psychological, and habitual, that shape what you call knowledge. As you practice this, something subtle changes. You grow less attached to conclusions. You grow more observant of the reasoning behind them. The mind becomes more sincere, less defensive. Doubt, once feared as destabilizing, now stabilizes your inquiry by removing false certainty. Al Ghazali's insight becomes clear. Purification is not the destruction of understanding but the removal of what obstructs it. Through disciplined doubt, the mind becomes transparent to itself. In that transparency, reasoning aligns more closely with reality. The process does not end with an answer. It ends with the removal of what prevents you from seeing. Having moved through doubt, you notice a new clarity that does not arise from argument. Al Ghazali described this shift as an inner transformation rather than an intellectual breakthrough. You see that when thought quiets, understanding emerges naturally. It is not constructed. It is not defended. It simply appears when the mind stops interfering with itself. This insight is not mystical, it is practical. When attachment loosens and assumptions dissolve, awareness perceives more accurately. Clarity comes not from effort but from the absence of distortion. In this state, logic and awareness no longer struggle. They operate together, each serving its proper role without competing. At the end of this inquiry, the movement of thought slows. You recognize that certainty does not arise from the force of reasoning but from the quietness that follows it. Al Ghazali's journey reveals that truth does not belong to the thinker. It appears when the thinker stops insisting on ownership. In this stillness, thought continues, but it no longer demands confirmation. Awareness remains steady and unaffected. There is no final conclusion, only the quiet recognition that seeing clearly requires no assertion. Reason has done its work. Doubt has done its work. What remains is understanding without effort, clarity without claim, and a silence that needs nothing further. You begin by examining the quiet confidence you place in your own mind. You assume that what feels logical must be true, that what appears coherent must be reliable. Yet when you look closely, you notice how often your conclusions arise not from verification but from habit. This is the point at which Al Ghazali enters your reflection. He suggests that what you call certainty may be nothing more than familiarity strengthened by repetition. Reason creates the impression of solidity, but that solidity may conceal its own foundations. You observe how quickly thought converts preference into argument and how naturally the mind defends the judgments it already holds. If the mind is the source of certainty, how can it measure the validity of certainty without stepping outside itself? To understand why Al Ghazali questioned the stability of logic, you consider the world in which he lived. 11th century Baghdad was saturated with scholarship. Philosophers debated abstract principles, theologians refined doctrines, and jurists sought precision in every ruling. The intellectual climate was vibrant, confident, and deeply committed to rational inquiry. Yet Al Ghazali observed that despite the abundance of argument, clarity remained elusive. Schools of thought contradicted one another, each claiming certainty while exposing the limitations of the others. Within this environment, Al Ghazali recognized that logical brilliance did not guarantee inner understanding, only the appearance of it. Al Ghazali's turning point emerged when he examined the foundations of knowledge with honest precision. He noticed that the senses, though immediate, often distort. He saw that memory, though continuous, easily reshapes details. And he realized that reason, though structured, rests on assumptions it cannot justify. This produced a quiet crisis, not emotional instability, but intellectual clarity. You begin to sense the same shift. You see how many of your convictions rely on interpretations you never questioned. Logic can imitate truth skillfully, yet imitation remains imitation. Al Ghazali concluded that understanding does not begin with arguments. It begins with purifying the lens through which arguments appear. This insight marks the threshold of deeper inquiry. As you continue examining your thinking, you notice how effortlessly the mind constructs patterns that resemble logic. A belief repeated often enough becomes indistinguishable from rational insight. You watch how thought takes a preference, surrounds it with justification, and presents it as the product of analysis. This process is subtle. It feels natural. It feels convincing. Yet conviction, you realize, is not evidence. Al Ghazali warned that the mind creates coherence not because coherence reveals truth but because coherence preserves comfort. Rationality becomes a structure that mirrors the self's needs. Arguments are shaped long before they are articulated. The listener, guided through this inner observation, begins to recognize how attachment disguises itself as reasoning. In this recognition, logic is not discarded, it is repositioned. You see that logic is invaluable for examining conclusions, but insufficient for revealing the motives that shape the conclusions in the first place. When you observe this movement in real time, a slight shift occurs. Thought becomes less authoritative and more transparent. You witness the mechanics behind what once felt natural. Through Al Ghazali's lens, you begin to understand how easily the mind produces the illusion of truth using the materials of habit. This is the quiet beginning of intellectual honesty. You turn your attention to the feeling of certainty itself. Certainty appears solid, but Al Ghazali demonstrated that it is often constructed. The mind organizes impressions into a pattern, then treats the pattern as objective evidence. You see this when you recall a memory with absolute confidence, only to discover later that details shifted without your awareness. You see it when an argument feels compelling because it aligns with your assumptions. Certainty, in this view, is not a sign of truth but a psychological state. It arises when the mind experiences internal consistency, regardless of whether that consistency corresponds to reality. You begin to observe moments when certainty emerges too quickly, forming not from analysis but from the need for stability. Al Ghazali explained that this tendency is universal. The mind seeks coherence, and once coherence appears, it interprets it as proof. Yet this proof may be only the mind confirming itself. Through this awareness, you begin to loosen your grip on the feeling of correctness. You examine how thought constructs meaning, how it arranges fragments into conclusions, and how it protects those conclusions once formed. In watching this process, clarity emerges, not the clarity of final answers, but the clarity of seeing the mechanisms behind them. Certainty becomes less of a possession and more of a pattern the mind produces. What remains is a quieter relationship with your own thoughts. Having examined certainty, you return to the structure of reason itself. Reason is indispensable. It reveals contradictions, organizes ideas, and offers precision. But as Al Ghazali emphasized, reason cannot justify the assumptions from which it begins. Every logical chain rests on premises that are accepted, not proven. You observe this within your own reasoning. When you follow an argument to its source, you eventually arrive at an unexamined belief, a foundational idea you assume without knowing why.